After DEMRI's death, Layne Staley kept her teddy bear with him until he died 6 years later. This is a true story. The last time DEMRI's mother Kathleen saw Layne was in 1997, the year after DEMRI died. Layne asked Kathleen if he could have the teddy bear DEMRI kept with her at the hospital where she passed away. DEMRI, sadly, had been hospitalized due to her addiction. She died on October 29, 1996. Her mother Kathleen gave Layne Staley the teddy bear. After Layne died due to his addiction in 2002, Kathleen got back the teddy bear when it was found amongst Layne Staley's belongings. Now, unfortunately, DEMRI's mother Kathleen passed away from cancer in 2023. May she rest in peace. I'm not sure who currently has possession of that teddy bear, but it would be interesting if Alice in Chains would write a tribute song to Layne and DEMRI, and maybe even include that teddy bear in the lyrics or in the music video. Now, before DEMRI's mother passed away, she actually reached out to me here on my channel. In particular, she left a positive comment on the original documentary I made about Layne and DEMRI back in 2022. I've come across more information about Layne and DEMRI since, and so I wanted to put together an updated documentary here. Quotes from Layne Staley's mother, Mark Lanegan of Screaming Trees, Duff McKagan of Guns N' Roses, and many of Layne's other friends will be shared throughout this video, as well as quotes from DEMRI's friends, and at the very end of this video, I'm going to show you the location where Layne Staley died. This is from a video I took in Seattle in 2020. Now, for those of you who may not be familiar with Layne and DEMRI's story, just to quickly touch base, Layne Staley and DEMRI PARROTT were an on and off couple for the better part of a decade. They were even engaged in 1992. As a matter of fact, DEMRI had picked out a wedding dress and they had chosen a venue for their wedding. When Layne died in 2002, his memorial service was symbolically held at the same venue the wedding with DEMRI was supposed to take place. At the time of their deaths, DEMRI was 27 and Layne was 34. Unfortunately, their addictions, and in particular their addiction to heroin, played a central role in both of them passing away. DEMRI's mother, Kathleen, was actually a substance abuse counselor. According to Kathleen, DEMRI thought the irony was hilarious. Now, I don't want to focus predominantly on the negative aspects of Layne and DEMRI's relationship, because there were some great happy things too. But unfortunately, when it comes to a tragic love story, it's impossible to avoid the darker side of things. At the end of the day, it is a tragic love story. With that said, before getting into the heavier stuff, I want to share with you a few quotes from some of DEMRI's friends, where they discuss some of the positive aspects. The first is a quote from Barbara DiRaio, a friend of DEMRI's who runs the website rememberlayne.com. Quote, "DEMRI was my close friend, and I know people who love Layne and his music are interested in finding out who DEMRI was, and I think she'd think that's cool. I always used to say she burned her candle on both ends, and that was truly how she lived her life. No one could rein her in. No one." Now, DEMRI was a huge fan of bands like The Cure, Violent Femmes, Jane's Addiction, and she was actually personally friends with Perry Farrell from Jane's Addiction. She loved to create crafts like paper collages and decoupage, which is where you cut out things from different papers and craft them together. She'd also cut out pictures and then plaster the walls in her apartment and then later even in her hospital room. She loved dried flowers and incense. But DEMRI was not a hippie, goth, or grunge girl. She was her own creation. She was the it girl in Seattle in the early 90s, and anyone who knew her and the club scene at the time, I doubt, would argue with me on that. End quote. Now, before I share more specifically from DEMRI's friends, I want to share with you a few quotes from people who knew both Layne and DEMRI regarding their early heroin usage. The debate over who started heroin first, Layne or DEMRI, is a controversial subject. Some people claim it was DEMRI who introduced Layne to heroin, and therefore she's the villain in this story. But there are other sources who suggest it wasn't DEMRI. I will explore this debate in much more detail later on in this video, but regardless of who started heroin first, according to their friend David Duet, both Layne and DEMRI were immediately hooked. David Duet was a friend of theirs from Seattle. In Mark Yarm's book, Everybody Loves Our Town, David said that when Layne and DEMRI first tried heroin, they loved it so much that they had to call him to let him know how great it was. According to David, that's when he knew Layne and DEMRI were doomed. Quote, "I was in Houston working at a nightclub when the phone rang in the office. This was probably in 1991. It was Layne and DEMRI, and they had to find me to tell me that they started doing dope and how wonderful it was. And right then I knew they were goners. You can just tell when you talk to certain people. You can tell when they're lifers. Very seldom have I been wrong." End quote. In the same book, Johnny Bacolis, a close friend of Layne Staley's who also knew DEMRI really well, states that Layne was in fact in love with heroin when he first tried it. Quote, I found out Layne was on heroin after the Alice in Chains Van Halen tour in 1991. Someone, I don't want to say who, brought him some heroin because they couldn't find any coke, and Layne tried it. And he said that was the first time he really thanked God. He literally looked up to the sky and said, thank you for this feeling. End quote. Now, both Johnny Bacolis and David Duet recall that it was 1991 when Layne and DEMRI first tried heroin, but another one of their friends, Damon Stewart, seems to believe it was 1990, the year Facelift was released, that DEMRI and Layne tried heroin. This is also from Mark Yarm's book. Quote, right after the release of Facelift, Layne and I became roommates in Seattle. I had started working for Sony Records at the time doing a regional A&R job, artist and repertoire. And with Alice in Chains being signed to a Sony label, it was a little bit awkward for me and Layne. The Sony people were trying to use me as eyes and ears to report back. Is he doing drugs? It wasn't a blatant thing, but it was definitely implied a couple of times that they wanted to know how Layne was doing. I can understand that to a degree, but Layne and I were pals, and I wasn't going to play a tattletale game. Layne was using. There was no question about that. Him and his girlfriend DEMRI both lived with me at the time. They were very discreet about it, though there was one time where I found a spoon and it was very obvious what it had been used for. I adored both of them, but we definitely had plenty of conversations that were like, look, it's not fair for me to say what's right or wrong for you guys, but I can't have this going on here and be wondering if you guys are going to be able to wake up or not. End quote. Now, switching back specifically to DEMRI people, I want to share with you a quote from one of her childhood best friends, Carrie Simmons. In this quote, Carrie talks about what DEMRI was like growing up, DEMRI's love for life, and ultimately where Carrie thinks DEMRI's downfall may have started. This is from an interview by Helena Harlan from worldofdemri.substack.com. Quote, DEMRI and I had so much fun together growing up. I miss her so much. I want people to know she was a beautiful light. She always had a sparkle in her eye and a vibrant smile. We loved to sing, dance, dress up. She'd ride my horse. I would put her on my bike handlebars. She was always short and little, so she fit perfectly on them. A really fond memory I have is sleeping over with about 4 girls, and we were laying on our friend Shannon's waterbed singing Leather and Lace by Fleetwood Mac. DEMRI would sing the guy part, and I would sing the girl part. DEMRI also had a very sweet voice. Her laugh was contagious. We had this silly call we would yell down the school locker halls to let each other know that we were there exchanging books before classes. I was so sad and shocked when I heard the path her life took towards the end. She'd call me a couple of times to meet up and party with them, but I was on a different path at that point. My brother was with them and shared updates with me when he would run into her and Layne. I knew and still knew a lot of people in the music scene, so I kept tabs. I wasn't into drugs because they scared me, but I regret not trying to help her and not being there more for her emotionally towards the end. But I didn't know it was the end so soon. DEMRI began modeling and doing hair shows in Seattle in 1987. It was her senior year of high school, and the whole grunge scene with underground raves was so big. She was so vibrant and full of light that she attracted energy vampires, I call them, and what I like to call the dark side. I believe as she began to experiment more, it just pulled her in deeper. We all got caught up in the music industry, but I drew the line early on that I knew not to cross. It's really sad and breaks my heart. I pray people find a higher path for their journey and deal with trauma and struggles, and for them to be able to lead strong, loving, fulfilling lives. End quote. When it comes to Layne and DEMRI, understandably due to how famous Layne is, he gets most of the focus. It's well known that Layne tried to kick his heroin addiction on various occasions, but it's not well documented that DEMRI also tried to kick her addiction. The following is a quote from Sage Viniconis, a former employee at the Off-Ramp. The Off-Ramp was a famous club in Seattle. He worked there from 91 to 93. The following quote is from an interview by Helena Harlan for worldofdemri.substack.com. Quote, one time when she was kicking heroin, DEMRI stayed with me for about a month. She never ripped me off and we never fooled around, but I'd hold her when she started shaking from withdrawal. And I'd clean her up after she'd vomit all over herself. She was a very dear spirit and I did my best to help her. We had met at the off-ramp. I was pouring a pitcher of beer for customers when this woman with long hair flew past me and took a sharp turn into the broom closet. Next thing I hear, boom, Buckets and brooms are smashing, and then silence. I didn't even charge the customers for their beer. I was focused on and worried if this girl in the closet was okay. I helped DEMRI get on her feet, and she hugged me. She said, however, that she still needed help. I asked her what help she needed, and she said she needed dope. I told her I didn't have any marijuana on me. And then she said, "That's not the dope I need. I need heroin." I said, "Oh honey, you're too beautiful to allow that to taint your life. Save your soul. Don't let heroin into your world." Then she kissed me on the lips and bolted out the door. That was our first encounter. I never saw her truly descend into addiction, but I was there to help her on 2 different occasions to kick heroin. I fed her, gave her tons of art supplies to create with, cleaned up her vomit, held her when she had the shakes. Yeah, it was an ordeal. The only rule I had was she knew if she went out the door of my apartment, it would lock behind her, so she'd be locked out. She was definitely a carefree spirit, but also a caring one. When I asked her to hook me up with a couple of her girlfriends who I thought were attractive, for instance, she said no. She said they were all nuts and that I didn't deserve to be caught up in that mess. She hung with a pack of wild women. They were all sassy and partied hard. It was wild times. Luckily, many people survived those times. Sadly, unlike DEMRI. I actually met my current wife at the off-ramp. We dated for about 3 months back then and went our separate ways, remaining friends over all the years. Then, in 2016, we reacquainted our love for one another, and 2 years later, we were married. End quote. Now, I want to share with you a few quotes from one of Layne Staley's best friends, Mark Lanegan. Mark Lanegan himself is a Seattle legend. Mark and his band Screaming Trees never got as big as Alice in Chains, but they were still an important grunge band, and Mark in particular was very close with both Layne and Kurt Cobain. With regards to DEMRI, Mark had multiple things to say about her in his book Sing Backwards and Weep. If you want an unfiltered view about the dark side of the grunge movement, this is worth checking out. The first DEMRI-related quote I want to share with you is how apparently DEMRI wanted to hook up with Mark, even though she was dating Layne. It's well documented that, unfortunately, both DEMRI and Layne cheated on each other various times. This exchange between Mark and DEMRI happened at some point in the late 80s. Quote, "For years, Layne had a passionate on and off relationship with a girl named DEMRI, a friend of my ex-girlfriend Anna. Their relationship was marked with dizzying highs and dark, depressing lows. She was said to be somewhat indiscriminate when it came to hooking up with people, much like myself. Who knows, I thought before I really knew him, maybe it's an open relationship. But once Layne and I became friends, it became clear that DEMRI's behavior caused Layne some pain, even though they both cheated on each other. I had gotten a glimpse into her straightforward approach before I'd even met Layne. Ironically, in the same way that I met Layne, DEMRI and I encountered each other for the first time outside of a Seattle drug house. As I was leaving, she was going in. 'Hey there, aren't you Anna's boyfriend? I'm DEMRI.' I was instantly attracted to this sexy, smiling girl. The first thought that rolled through my head was, wow. She had this alluring outward sexuality, a beautiful face, and the most extraordinary eyes. 'Yeah, I am. Please don't tell her you saw me here, though. That would cause problems,' I said. I felt like such a jerk whenever I was compelled to ask a stranger to keep my secrets, but most addicts were keeping secrets from someone themselves. There was some semblance of a code of secrecy among certain junkies. 'No problem here, handsome. What are you doing right now?' she asked me with a coy smile. 'No plans, just heading home.' 'Well, why don't you come home with me? We can get high and have sex.' That came out of the blue. DEMRI's brazen, direct approach put me on heels for a second, but struck me like a kick to the balls. A shockingly pleasurable one. I don't think that would be a very good idea. Thanks, but I can't." Then she grabbed my hand and said, "Oh, come on, I'll never tell anyone. You're cute, I like you, nobody's at my place. Come on, you won't be sorry." I was sorely tempted, but I had a feeling I would somehow end up very sorry. Your private business could spread quickly through the small, incestuous Seattle music scene. DEMRI was beautiful. It was the type of situation I found nearly impossible to pass up. But DEMRI's connection to my girlfriend and to this guy Layne that I'd not met yet but already deeply respected as an artist made me think twice. For once, I was smart enough not to take the bait. With more than a little regret, I again declined DEMRI and walked home alone. But for a while afterward, it continued to play heavily on my mind. End quote. Now, heroin addiction, of course, was not uniquely a Layne and DEMRI issue. Seattle in general has had a heroin problem for a long time. At the end of this documentary, I'm going to share with you a few quotes from people who describe what the situation was like regarding heroin in the Seattle grunge scene in the 90s. But first, let's get back specifically to Layne and DEMRI. According to many people who knew Layne, including Mark Lanigan, DEMRI Perot's death in 1996 basically killed Layne Staley emotionally and sent him on an even bigger downward spiral than he was already on. According to Mark, when he first spoke to Layne over the phone about DEMRI's death, Layne was in shambles. Unfortunately, Mark was on tour in Europe with the Screaming Trees and couldn't be there in Seattle to comfort Layne. Quote, "There was a knock on my hotel room door. I looked out the peephole and saw it was a friend on the other side. I unlocked the door and let him in. By the sad, beaten-down look on his face, I knew he had some bad news. Hey, Mark, I'm sorry to tell you this, but DEMRI passed away. Layne would like you to call him as soon as you can." No, not again, I thought. This was going to destroy Layne. He had loved her so passionately that after their final breakup, one of many breakups in their tempestuous years-long on-again, off-again relationship, Layne had made a conscious decision to never date another woman. If not with DEMRI, he preferred to be alone. My heart was broken for him. I called him and left a message with my room number and the phone number to the hotel, and he called right back. The first thing he said to me was, "Oh man, I can't believe it, she's gone." Then he broke down in tears. I reacted, "I'm so sorry, brother. I am so sorry. I don't know what to say. I'm just incredibly sorry this happened to you." Even though I'd had plenty of experience with loss, I was still a piss-poor comfort to those in pain. I had never developed the necessary skills to verbally express any real words of wisdom to help anyone in that way. My first public response to death of a friend was stoicism. Privately, I might cry like a baby. Through his tears, Layne said, "I can't stand to be alone right now. When are you coming back?" "I just got here today, Layne. We're not back for 6 weeks." "Crap," he said. "I wish you were coming back sooner. I need to hang out with someone. This is tearing me up." "I'm sorry, bro. Look, my friend Simon is at my place. Go stay there. I need someone to keep an eye on him anyways. Kick him out of their bedroom and you take it. He can sleep on the couch or the mattress. You be doing me a favor, man." Layne had been around Simon, and I knew he could tolerate him. Simon's generally quiet nature made him easy to be around, and I trusted him. "Okay, I'm going over there," Layne said quickly. "Just let me know when. I should call Simon and give him a heads up," I responded. "Right now," Layne said. I quickly did the math. 2:30 in the afternoon in Paris meant it was 5:30 a.m. in Seattle. DEMRI's mother lived just a block from my apartment. I wondered if Layne might drop in there to offer his condolences, or get a tiny sip of relief in sharing their shared pain of loss, even though they'd had a bit of a strained relationship. Upon returning to Seattle after my horrific tour of Europe, the first thing Layne said to me when he saw me was, "Whoa, man, what the hell happened to you?" "Let's just say it was a rough ride," I said, and left it at that. I was relieved to have reliable sources of heroin at my disposal once more, and the three of us stayed awake for days on end in my apartment, alternatively hitting the pipe with Simon obsessively scanning the floor looking for what we might have dropped. Eventually, Simon, like so many other addicts I've crossed paths with, went for a walk one day and simply never came back. Now it was just me and Layne. Layne spent a few more months in squalor with me in my small one-bedroom apartment. He never stopped grieving DEMRI's death. After a while, Layne's father, Phil, also an addict, took up Simon's dubious duties as our runner, which made for a weird dynamic. Finally, after almost 4 months, Layne began to crave isolation and moved back into his penthouse condo in the University District. End quote. DEMRI's death absolutely devastated Layne. She was by far the most important romantic relationship he ever had. Now, when exactly did Layne meet DEMRI? Layne Staley and DEMRI Perrottt met either in 1988 or 1989. There are different accounts as to how exactly they met, which I'll be taking a look at later on as well. In any case, upon meeting, they immediately felt a connection and began dating shortly afterwards. Layne had a good relationship with DEMRI Perrott's family and vice versa. They had the makings of what could have been a long and happy relationship, but unfortunately, that didn't end up being the case. They had a very up and down relationship. Despite all of that, however, Layne and DEMRI got engaged in 1992. What could have been a fresh start for them ultimately didn't pan out. They eventually called off their engagement and parted ways. However, despite parting ways, they still maintained contact with each other all the way until DEMRI PARROTT's untimely death in October of 96 at the age of 27. Although she died in October of 96, according to DEMRI's mother, Kathleen, DEMRI was first admitted to hospital for drug-related reasons in November of 1993. According to Kathleen, quote, DEMRI came to the hospital for the first time at the end of November of 93. She was in until January of 94. She got out and was back in March of 94, and at that time put on life support. When she would be in, she would come to the emergency room. They would admit her up into a medicine floor. Then she'd go from the medicine floor to the intensive care unit and life support, and then she wouldn't die. So she'd go back to the medicine floor. She'd be on IV and antibiotics for a month. This went on and on. She had her lungs operated on twice. She had her heart operated on twice. She suffered miserably. She'd tell me, I hate being intubated. I can't talk, and these people come and they ask me questions and I can't talk. And I feel like a fish in a fishbowl. End quote. Although they were no longer together during the last years of her life, Layne would periodically visit the hospital to check in on DEMRI. According to Kathleen, she once overheard Layne saying the following to DEMRI in the hospital. Quote, I should have gotten us out of here. I had the money. I could have done it. I should have gotten us out of here. End quote. Kathleen explains that out of here meant out of Seattle, away from people who were trying to give them drugs and get them high. Unfortunately, when it came to Layne Staley and DEMRI PARROTT, drugs were a major sore spot in their relationship. Both Layne and DEMRI have been accused of introducing the other to heroin. Most of the accounts I have read suggest that it was DEMRI who introduced Layne. However, there are accounts that suggest this was not true. For example, a friend of DEMRI's, Amber Ferrano, once said the following, quote, she did not use heroin until she was with him. DEMRI did not get Layne started in drugs. His history was prior to her, and tons of people know that. End quote. I'll be expanding on this topic of who may have introduced who to heroin later on in this video as well. In any case, Layne Staley ultimately died from drugs on April 5, 2002. Oddly enough, though unrelated to the story of Layne and DEMRI, Layne died exactly 8 years to the day Kurt Cobain died on April 5th of 94. There's no shortage of tragedy in the story of grunge. Layne Staley's relationship with DEMRI ended tragically. However, according to Jamie, Layne's sister, there was one aspect of their deaths which provided some solace to their friends and family. Reflecting on Layne Staley's funeral service, Jamie once said the following. This is from Alice in Chains' The Untold Story. Quote, looking back on it, a number of us obviously mentioned DEMRI when speaking at the service. I think that most people had the sense like, well, at least now they're together. End quote. Now, as mentioned earlier, there are different accounts as to how Layne and DEMRI met. What's agreed on by all parties is that they met in the late 80s, and that soon after meeting, they had begun dating. What's not agreed upon is exactly when, where, and how they met. In one version of the story, DEMRI was introduced to Layne through a girl named Sally Portillo in 1988. Sally was a friend of Layne's and would hang out with him at the Music Bank, Alice in Chains' rehearsal studio and makeshift living quarters. According to Sally, DEMRI was already aware of who Layne was, though she had not yet met him. The following is a quote from Sally. Quote, my feeling on it, I can't say for sure, is that she knew that Layne and I palled around together. I was always with him. He was always with me. I was always at the Music Bank. DEMRI asked to tell me a little bit about Layne. Will you introduce me to Layne? No one was ever serious relationship-wise until it came to DEMRI, and then when it came to Layne and DEMRI, he was all about her. End quote. In another version of how they met, DEMRI's mother Kathleen once recalled the following. This is from Alice in Chains' The Untold Story. Quote, she met Layne in 1989. DEMRI was working in the mall, and there was a girl working in the store with her, and the girl invited her to a party, and the girl was from the Seattle area. DEMRI told me later that on the way to this party, the girl turned and looked at her and said, I just made the biggest mistake of my life. And DEMRI said, what? And she said, bringing you to this party. I know my boyfriend's going to fall in love with you. That was Layne, and the rest is history. I think it was love at first sight. End quote. Now, it's not clear if the girl Kathleen is referring to in that quote is Sally, but if it is, it would seem to align with some of the details of Sally's recollection of how Layne and DEMRI met. Though, of course, there are still some differences between Kathleen's and Sally's versions of the story, including which year the introduction took place. In any case, for her part, Layne Staley's mother Nancy once said the following. This is from Grunge is Dead. Quote, I think they met at a party. She was 17 and he 19, about that. He was very shy and she was a bright, shining little star flitting about. As time went on, she was part of the family. End quote. Layne and DEMRI had good relationships with each other's families. The following is from DEMRI's mother Kathleen. Quote, I knew they were hanging out. Layne was very respectful. He was a sweetheart. The two of them, before drugs, were always laughing. They were always happy. But Layne hated the fame. He couldn't go to a cash machine without it being written in the papers. Once at dinner with Layne and DEMRI, they had just brought our food, the three of us, and were involved in a family conversation. This guy comes up and just, you're Layne Staley. My girlfriend's in the back car. I really need your autograph. I have to take it to my girlfriend. It just kind of hit me the wrong way. I turned and I looked at this person and I said, we're trying to have a family dinner here. I'm sure that Layne would love to write his name on a napkin for you after we have our dinner. And of course, he's backing up and backing off. He apologized and left. Then I said to Layne, oh honey, I'm so sorry. That was not for me to do. Please forgive me. But he replied, oh Kathleen, I just wish I could take you with me everywhere I go. People approached my daughter and would say, oh, I know you. You're Layne's girlfriend. And she would say, no, I'm DEMRI. DEMRI had a strong sense of self since she was 2 years old, and she started losing her identity to Layne, being identified as Layne's girlfriend. Layne, on the other hand, started losing his identity to the band. There were times when people came up to him and said, oh, I know you. You're Alice in Chains. And he'd say, do I look like an Alice to you? End quote. Layne's fame not only hurt DEMRI, however, but also Layne himself. The following is also from Kathleen from Alice in Chains, The Untold Story. Quote, once when Layne was in rehab, I got to visit him on a Sunday afternoon. I think Jerry and Sean had been there and left when I got there. I think I saw them. Layne was sitting outside on this picnic table talking, and all of a sudden you hear Alice in Chains music. Layne was devastated. He started to cry because from that point on, he wasn't a guy with an addiction problem going to treatment. He was Alice in Chains. End quote. Fame ultimately had a negative impact on Layne's relationship with DEMRI. In an interview with journalist John Widerhorn that was released in Rolling Stone on February 8th of 96, Layne Staley said the following when reflecting on his breakup with DEMRI. Quote, I can definitely say rock and roll was a huge factor in us breaking up. When you're in a relationship, the girl usually instigates the big idea that you were joined at the hip. So when the grifting comes, it's really painful. This isn't a dig on women, but I think women are so different chemically from men, and it makes it hard to sustain a relationship. They have periods. They go through horrific, awful emotional swings, and trying to be logical with a person that's got a whole different logic running around in her brain is just impossible. When you're in a relationship, the girl usually instigates this big truth that you were put on earth to be together. And after being with a person a long time and being convinced that you're soulmates, you can get really crushed if things eventually fall apart. When I broke up with my last real girlfriend, life was just dismal. I didn't know how to live or what to do. And then I had to realize, okay, I got along for 20 years before I met her, and I had good times. But right now I'm alone, and I'm totally cool with it. End quote. One particular episode which hurt Layne's relationship with DEMRI was the album cover for Dirt. Released in 1992, Dirt is considered by many as Alice in Chains' best album. The album cover for Dirt is one of the most iconic images in grunge history. The album cover features a young woman laying on her back on a cracked desert floor, her body partially buried underneath. The model in the image looks like DEMRI, but it isn't her. It was somebody else. According to DEMRI's mother, Kathleen, DEMRI was very hurt by this. More on that shortly. The model featured in the image is Mariah O'Brien, and the photographer is Rocky Shank, who's worked with Alice in Chains on many occasions. The following is a quote from Rocky Shank, where he explains how they created the image. This quote is from Alice in Chains' The Untold Story. Quote, we created the cracked desert floor with clay rolled out on foam core raised up on apple boxes. There was a cutout in the center of the foam core for the model to slip into, so she would appear half buried in the desert floor. I cut the miniature mountains out of foam core as well, and we put up a painted sky backdrop behind the mountains. Mariah's hair was short at the time, so we put a long wig on her so her hair would flow out artistically into the desert floor. After getting her in place, we sealed her up with more clay, which we then dried around her with hair dryers. Poor Mariah was stuck in that position for many, many hours as I tried a variety of different lighting effects and visual approaches." End quote. Now, as mentioned, the model on the album cover is Mariah O'Brien, though at the time the album was released, many of the people close to the band thought it was DEMRI PARROTT, Layne Staley's longtime on-again, off-again girlfriend. According to DEMRI's mother, Kathleen Austin, DEMRI was hurt that the band hired a model who looked like her to be on the cover. The following is a quote from Kathleen Austin. Quote, "DEMRI was really hurt when they chose a model that looked so much like her that people thought it was her, because it put her in a position where people would come up to her and say, 'Oh wow, I saw you on the cover of Dirt,' and she'd have to say, 'No, that's not me.' Sometimes people believed her, and sometimes they didn't believe her. She wouldn't have minded if they got a model that didn't look like her, but it put her in a really awkward position, and it was really hurtful to her. She was just trying to maintain her own identity, never wanted to just be known as somebody's girlfriend." End quote. According to Kathleen Austin, Layne Staley's rising fame was beginning to overshadow DEMRI PARROTT's identity. She isn't even sure if DEMRI would have posed for the album cover if she'd been asked to. It's interesting Kathleen would say that because DEMRI did in fact do some modeling. DEMRI PARROTT was a very outgoing artistic person ever since she was a child. She was born on February 22nd, 1969, to Stephen PARROTT and Kathleen Austin. Though they wouldn't meet until the late 80s, there are several parallels between DEMRI PARROTT's childhood and Layne Staley's childhood. Like Layne, DEMRI's parents would divorce. Like Layne, DEMRI would live with her mother, and like Layne, DEMRI's mother would remarry. As a matter of fact, DEMRI's mother remarried twice. DEMRI had one half-brother from Kathleen's second marriage and two half-brothers from Kathleen's third marriage. Interestingly, Kathleen was actually a practicing counselor working in addiction. She once told author David DeSola the following, quote, "If anybody had ever told me that my daughter would become a heroin addict, I wouldn't have believed it." End quote. As mentioned, DEMRI was a very artistic, outgoing person. When DEMRI was in high school, she was part of the school choir. Her high school choir teacher, Lyle Ford, once recalled the following. This is from Alice in Chains' The Untold Story. Quote, "DEMRI really did love music and the performing arts. She definitely had the bent towards the performing arts and was very social. Some students, they really don't go up and talk to teachers. They kind of hang with their friends. DEMRI was very social with other students and their teachers. She was a competent singer, but I think she was also a dancer." End quote. Carrie Pfeiffer Simmons, a friend of DEMRI's from school, once said the following about her. Quote, "She was very outgoing, very well liked, just petite, beautiful. She just lit up the room. She liked to be the class clown, get attention, and joke around. She would sneak out through the windows of the classroom and skip class. She was always doing funny things or charming the teachers so that she would get good grades that way. I know that she wanted to be in acting, and I know that she wanted to be an actress and be in movies. She had to be in the limelight." End quote. Kathleen once recalled that a few months prior to meeting Layne, DEMRI had an audition for a singing part in a musical called Cinderella Rock. It was a public audition in a mall in front of an audience. As Kathleen recalls, quote, "She starts this song and then she stops and says, 'Obviously you can tell I can't sing.' Then she just played the crowd. It was amazing." End quote. Given DEMRI's charming personality and good looks, it's no surprise a lot of guys were attracted to her. There was one specific situation in particular where this became a problem for Layne. Though Layne and DEMRI were crazy about each other, they both cheated on each other multiple times. One particular instance which really bothered Layne was DEMRI PARROTT's relationship with Dwayne Bodenheimer. Dwayne was, and still is, the singer of The Derelicts, a punk band from Seattle. DEMRI and Dwayne started a relationship at some point in 1990-91. The problem was, DEMRI's relationship with Dwayne began while she was still with Layne. Dwayne Bodenheimer and DEMRI saw each other usually while Layne Staley was out touring with Alice in Chains. For his part, Layne Staley had his suspicions and eventually knew what was going on. He confronted Dwayne Bodenheimer about the situation several times, most notably during the shoot for the movie Singles. Shot in Seattle from March 11, 1991 to May 24 of 91, the Singles movie holds a unique place in grunge history. Musicians from several Seattle bands including Soundgarden, Pearl Jam, and Alice in Chains were involved with the film in various capacities. One day, during the shooting for the movie, Layne and Dwayne were sitting at the same table. According to Dwayne Bodenheimer, Layne Staley said the following to him, quote, "It should have been you that died instead of Andy Wood. I hate you." End quote. Andy Wood, of course, was the lead singer of Mother Love Bone and Malfunction. He died of a heroin overdose on March 19, 1990, about a year before the Singles movie shoot. Regarding Layne's comment that Dwayne should have died instead of Andy, Dwayne himself once recalled the following, quote, "Layne said that to me, and that was very hurtful. It hurt me. I wasn't like a total jerk. I did have feelings. I felt bad about what was going on, but I couldn't help it because I really did love her. She really just, blew me away. Beautiful, amazing girl. Good energy, just amazing. I developed a little crush on her. DEMRI and I started hanging out. She was a very sexual girl, and I tried to not do that because I knew who her boyfriend was, but it just happened one day. We had a relationship, and there were drugs involved. We were together a lot. I fell in love with her. I really cared for her and loved her. She kind of said that her and Layne had a kind of open relationship." End quote. David Duet, a friend of Layne's, once confirmed the open nature of Layne's relationship with DEMRI. Quote, "Layne and DEMRI had kind of an open relationship. In the position he was in, it's probably the only way he could have had a lasting relationship. Layne was very true to DEMRI in his heart, but he related many, many wild touring adventures to me." End quote. Now, going back to DEMRI and Dwayne Bodenheimer, according to Dwayne, it was ultimately DEMRI who called off their relationship. Despite the very intense ups and downs between DEMRI and Layne Staley over the years, the two continued to care for each other, even after they had officially parted ways a few years prior to DEMRI's death in 1996. Though it is known that Layne Staley and DEMRI PARROTT were not together during the last years of her life, it's not clear exactly when the breakup took place, or who exactly broke up with who. According to musician Randy Biro, a friend of the band's who also contributed some vocal work to Jar of Flies, it was DEMRI who broke up with Layne. Quote, "She stopped seeing him. She tried to get away from him because she felt like she was going to ruin his life. He was in love with her. But everybody knew that Layne was blaming DEMRI, and people were trying to keep them apart all the time. So I was under the impression that she tried to get away from him to give him a chance to live life. I, however, had no interest in breaking them up. There was no one to blame for his drug addiction." End quote. Over the years, even while they were alive, many people blamed DEMRI for Layne Staley's addiction to heroin. Many people believe she was the one who introduced him to the drug. However, as mentioned before, there are those who suggest this was not the case. For example, a friend of DEMRI's, Amber Ferrano, once said the following, quote, "She did not use heroin until with him. DEMRI did not get Layne started in drugs. His history was prior to her, and tons of people know that." End quote. Now, one of the people who has accused DEMRI of being the one to introduce Layne to heroin is John Starr. John Starr is actually the father of Mike Starr, Alice in Chains' original bass player. Like Layne, Mike also had his struggles with heroin. John Starr once said the following, quote, "Drugs came as a result of Layne's connection with DEMRI. They did no drugs until they started touring. I loved her. Her and I got along great. Mike and Layne and her had more fun than everybody else on tour together. But she introduced Layne to heroin. Layne introduced Mike to heroin." End quote. For her part, DEMRI's mother Kathleen once said the following, quote, "People who love DEMRI blame Layne for her addiction. That's what people do when you love somebody and they're hanging with somebody else and they're doing bad things. You don't blame that person. You say, oh, it's their friends. Oh, he's running with a bad group of people. End quote. Regardless of who introduced who, both DEMRI and Layne died heroin-related deaths. Layne in 2002 and DEMRI in 1996. The following is from PARROTT, an ex-girlfriend of Jerry Cantrell's. This is from Grunge's Dead. Quote, Layne and DEMRI, another really cute couple that seemed very happy but very destructive. Oddly enough, I worked at Espresso Roma in the University District in Seattle, and she was working there as well. I didn't know her, and then later on, I saw her again. I think she went out with Paul Uhler from Sweetwater first, and then she started dating Layne. Kind of went back and forth between those two a couple of times. She was like the sweetest, cutest tiny hippie chick. Just adorable and gorgeous. Never would I have ever imagined what happened to her happening. She started using heroin with Layne, I guess. That was later on in their relationship when it got really bad. They were both using, and they were both junkies, essentially. They stopped seeing each other, they went different ways. I know for a fact that she ended up doing all kinds of things for drugs, and unfortunately, ended up in the hospital dying. End quote. According to DEMRI's mother, Kathleen, DEMRI spent much of the last years of her life in and out of the hospital. Though they were no longer together, Layne would often check in on her. Quote, DEMRI was sick and dying for those last 2.5 years. Layne would come by and stay with her in the hospital at night. Layne never recovered from losing her. End quote. That sentiment, that Layne never recovered from DEMRI's death, has been shared by many people who knew Layne. Jeff Gilbert, a DJ from Seattle who knew Layne, once said the following, quote, where it really went off the tracks for Layne was when his girlfriend DEMRI succumbed to heroin in October of '96. Those two were supposed to be together. That was a no-brainer for everyone who knew them. She was all he wanted to be with. She was such a small little gal, and the drugs just shut her down. After that, he was never the same. End quote. Nick Pollock, a friend of Layne's, shared a similar perspective. Quote, I know how much he loved DEMRI, and I can only imagine that really just obliterated him. End quote. Another friend of Layne's, Michelle Aaron Crane, who was loosely romantically linked with Layne after DEMRI, once said the following, quote, I think it's very likely he used her death as an excuse to throw in the towel, because that's what we do. The addict is always looking for excuses to use, and that's a pretty good one. End quote. Randy Byro, another friend of Layne's, put it poignantly, quote, when she died, that was it. He was done. End quote. Reflecting on DEMRI's death, Layne Staley's stepfather, Jim, recalled the following to author David DeSola, quote, I went over to the hospital and gave her a kiss on the forehead goodbye, and she was looking very peaceful. Layne obviously knew what had happened and was distraught and so forth, and while they had a very dynamic relationship, they certainly cared about each other and loved each other. So, Alice in Chains manager Susan Silver and I said our goodbyes. Mark Lanegan stayed with Layne at Layne's house, and that was the best thing to do. End quote. Mark Lanegan and Layne Staley were very close friends. As a matter of fact, Mark Lanegan was one of the last people to have interacted with Layne during his final years. Though DEMRI's passing, of course, wasn't the exact cause of Layne's death, it certainly contributed to his downfall in a very big way. According to Mark Lanegan, especially after DEMRI's death, Layne was determined on doing drugs regardless of the consequences. In an interview with Rolling Stone published on April 23, 2020, Mark Lanegan told the following to journalist Corey Groh about the death of Layne Staley. Quote, out of my friends, I was the guy who they always thought would never have a chance of getting clean because I was so maniacal in my approach. I would have climbed Mount Everest for drugs. I was always trying to kick. Layne Staley was a magical person who was also hell-bent on doing drugs until he died. The first time I saw him after I'd gotten clean, I'd been clean a year. I'm pretty sure that Jerry Cantrell and Mike Inez flew me up to Seattle because they were unable to get into his house. He had a camera and lived in the penthouse of this condo. So whenever anybody from that camp would come to see him, he would just ignore it. Jerry and Mike knew that when he saw me, he would let me in. I went along with that. And I also wanted him to see that I was clean, that it was possible to get clean, that his prediction that I would never be able to do it had failed. Hopefully, maybe it would give him the idea that he himself could do it too. But he didn't want to do it. When I got there, I said, "Hey man, it's been a while. I've been clean for more than 12 months. And he was like, "No, you weren't, man. You just left like 2 months ago." His sense of time had warped, and he wasn't buying the truth from me. I remember him saying at that point, "I always just keep thinking I'm gonna get that same feeling I got the first time again." And dude, I never got that first feeling again after the first time I ever did dope. I immediately had to do 5 times more to even get close to it. So for me, that was an impossibility, but that was his obsession. It's heartbreaking the way he went. I always knew that that's what was going to happen, although I had always hoped that there would be some medical emergency that would put him in the hospital and give him a moment away from the routine of crack and heroin that might give him a break and some insight. That medical emergency ended up being his death. I still love listening to Alice in Chains. When they come on the radio, it makes me feel good. But if Nirvana comes on the radio, it throws me into a depression. Like, if I'm in an Uber, you have to turn that off. And I think it's because of my own actions in the deaths of both these guys who I loved equally. Of course, I was not a great influence on Layne, but drugs were a mutual thing. I put it like this. Kurt was like a little brother. Layne was like a twin. End quote. Layne Staley ultimately died on April 5, 2002, though his body wasn't discovered for a few weeks. One of the notable things about Layne Staley's funeral service is that DEMRI was noticeably present in a sense. The following is from Kathleen, DEMRI's mother. Quote, "Because Layne basically became a recluse after Dem died, a lot of the stories about Layne ended when DEMRI died. So the people that got up and talked at his funeral, a lot of the stories were Layne and DEMRI and I, and there were photographs of her I'd never seen before. It was like being at a memorial service for my daughter 6 years later." End quote. Layne Staley's sister, Jamie, once shared a similar sentiment when reflecting on Layne's funeral service. Quote, "Looking back on it, a number of us obviously mentioned DEMRI when speaking at the service. I think that most people had the sense like, well, at least now they're together." End quote. Layne and DEMRI were one of the tragic couples in the story of grunge, a story which unfortunately has no shortage of tragedy. Now, as mentioned previously, during the years in between Layne Staley's breakup with DEMRI and DEMRI's death, the two of them still interacted with each other, most notably when Layne would go visit DEMRI when DEMRI was in the hospital at various points. As mentioned a bit earlier, there was another woman in Layne's life named Michelle Erin Crane. Layne didn't meet Michelle after DEMRI. They already knew each other, but their friendship really took off after Layne's breakup. As a matter of fact, according to Michelle, Layne at one point thought they were dating. Though they were never officially together, and though they apparently were never intimate, Michelle and Layne did have somewhat of a quasi-relationship. Michelle spent lots of time with Layne and was one of the few people he would allow into his apartment. According to Michelle, sometimes when she would be with Layne in his apartment, DEMRI would come knocking on the door. The following is a quote from Michelle Erin Crane where she discusses this. This is from Grunge is Dead. Quote, "Layne and his girlfriend DEMRI were together forever. Finally, they had broken up because he took the attitude that she was worse than he was. But I think she had to do worse things because she didn't have any money. When I would be over there at night watching movies, the doorbell would ring all the time, and he would be like, 'Shh, be quiet, pretend we're not here.' Sometimes, maybe it was her, and sometimes people coming to party with him. So I asked, 'Are you guys totally broken up? What's the deal?' And he said that she was pretty much a drug addict at that point, and was really struggling. I remember going over there in the afternoon once, and there was a note from her. It was like, 'I love you. I hope you're doing well.' He talked about her, and then when she finally died, even though they weren't together, he was devastated. You'd go to the house, go to the bathroom, and it was scary. Blood on the sink and stuff like that. I just grabbed garbage bags and started cleaning up. It was clear that he liked me, but we never fooled around because honestly, I was scared that he might have a disease. It seemed like he was getting the wrong idea after a couple of months. I just said, I can't keep coming over here and pretending everything is cool when it's not cool." End quote. The following are various quotes from Michelle Erin Crane where she discusses her relationship with Layne Staley. These quotes are from Grunge is Dead and Alice in Chains' The Untold Story. According to Michelle, on one occasion in particular when she was over at Layne's apartment watching TV with him, Layne said the following to her, quote, "I want you to know I'm not going to be like this forever. I want to have a normal life, a good life. I want to get married. I want to have kids." End quote. The following is a quote from Michelle Erin Crane where she reflects on this. This is from Alice in Chains' The Untold Story. Quote, "I thought what he said was very sweet. I was flattered because I knew he was saying it for my benefit. It was his way of saying to me, I like you. If you hang out for a while, I may be able to kick this with your support. Give me a reason to stop doing drugs." That is what his words meant, at least to some degree. But how can you take someone so loaded on drugs very seriously? He may have thought that in the moment, and he may have considered it from time to time, but the fact is just as quickly, he was back in the bathroom trying to find a vein. I wanted to like him, but I don't know if he had a disease. I don't know what the deal is. I'm not going to get involved with that, but I guess I was hoping foolishly that I could make a difference and inspire some sobriety or something. And then maybe I would have tried dating him if he had cleaned up, because I was definitely fond of him. At one point, he thought we were dating, but he realized we were not. His desire to want to spend time with me without wanting anything but some companionship was nice. Being invited into his rather isolated private world was intriguing to say the least. That, coupled with the fantasy that he might get over his addiction or that I could play a part in him getting over his addiction, was intriguing and even exciting. He was a beautiful person under all of that sickness, but I wasn't delusional, and I wasn't about to express these thoughts to him because I guess I had decided rather quickly that to hope would be to be disappointed. So I remained rather cool during our time spent together. I once had this epic dream that I was walking around this 60s motel. I was walking by all these motel rooms, and each door was open. In each room, there was a totally different scene going on. I walked by one door and looked in, and Layne is in the motel room. There's a kitchenette, and there's a pot on every burner of the stove. They're boiling over, and he was really perplexed and like, this stuff's boiling over. Kinda chaotic. I go in to take his hand, and I'm like, let's get out of here. End quote. Now, of course, Layne Staley's most well-known relationship was his relationship with longtime on-again, off-again girlfriend DEMRI PARROTT. Despite the fact that they were no longer together when she died, DEMRI's drug-related death in 1996 severely impacted Layne emotionally. In Michelle's opinion, DEMRI's death contributed to Layne's eventual downfall. Quote, "I think it's very likely he used her death as an excuse to throw in the towel, because that's what we do. The addict is always looking for an excuse to use, and that's a pretty good one." My aunt was the queen of the metal scene in the 80s, and Layne had a huge walk-in closet. It was his rental room at her place. Alice in Chains were total rockers then. I was really into the punk scene and thought they were kind of ridiculous. She was always trying to put me and Layne together. And I remember thinking it was cheesy because he had long golden blonde hair and he wore makeup and spandex. It was a weird thing. I had a dream about him one night, and my phone rang the morning. My aunt woke me up. She said, "Guess who I saw last night?" And I said, "Layne?" She's like, "I did. And he thought the girl I was with was you. He came running up to me and gave me and my girlfriend a hug, and then realized it wasn't you." Anyways, this one time I walked out of my apartment and he drove past me. He was a passenger in the car. The only thing I recognized was his eyes. He had big blue eyes, because his hair had grown out and was moosey brown. We made eye contact, the car pulled over, and his mom was driving. He got out. He looked terrible. His hands were all wrapped in ice bandages, with fingerless leather gloves over the bandages. He was holding this little kitten that his mom was helping him take to the vet. He jumped out of the car, and I was taken aback. It was shocking to see him look like that. He shook his head like, "Come to the other end of the car away from my mom." He's like, "Hey, I was wondering, are you in the program?" He meant Alcoholics Anonymous. I was like, "No, but I know a lot of people who are. I could hook you up with someone." He took my number and started calling me. It turns out that he only lived a few blocks away. So I started going over to his house. I was curious, felt sorry for him. We went and saw a few shows together, and he mostly wanted to hang out and watch movies because he was a wreck. The first couple of times I came over, he was like, "One day I would like to have a family. This is what's going on now, but I'm not always going to be like this." A couple of times he disappeared and I was concerned because we talked every day for a while. One time I didn't get a hold of him for a couple of days and he called me and said he was out in the woods with somebody. calling from a payphone. He didn't say it, but I could tell he was trying to detox. He had open sores, and I heard he ended up losing some fingers or his hands. I don't know exactly what was true. The last time I saw him, I was out for a jog, and this Trans Am with the Firebird painted on the hood had crashed into an ambulance. Layne and some white trash guy were fumbling around. Layne always wore this Australian big raincoat towards the end, and he was picking up all this stuff that was falling out of the car and out of his pockets. And every time he would bend over to pick something up, more paraphernalia would fall out of his pocket. It was weird. I will often awake in the middle of the night with the thoughts of Layne. I remember a sad or a sweet look he gave me, and even though I know it's stupid, never trust a junkie. I find myself riddled with guilt for not being more sensitive, open, or even helpful. He would often imply he was looking for a reason to get clean, and I replay those moments over and over again. These flashes in time sometimes keep me awake for hours and make my heart hurt. I know I hurt his feelings, and that haunts me. I wish I had been more sensitive, because I know, most people know, how capable he was of loving someone. Look at his love for DEMRI. But intellectually, I guess I did the right thing for me. End quote. Now, as mentioned earlier, unfortunately, both DEMRI PARROTT and Layne Staley cheated on each other multiple times. One of the more famous people Layne Staley allegedly cheated on DEMRI with was Kat Balin from Babes in Toyland. Both Layne and Kat are important figures from the 90s alternative music scene, but it's not very well known that they had this alleged romance with each other. Alice in Chains and Babes in Toyland toured with each other in 1993, and according to Kat's bandmate Maureen Herman, Layne and Kat became an item. The following is a quote from Maureen Herman from the book Everybody Loves Our Town. Quote, Layne and Kat started seeing each other on the tour, and then when we were in San Francisco, either Layne's girlfriend DEMRI was in town or Layne had a change of heart about the situation with Kat. Something happened, and he couldn't be hanging with Kat. I don't know what it was, but they had a falling out that day. So, Kat decides to react to the situation by doing excessive heroin. End quote. For her part, Kat denies having done excessive heroin during this tour, and she also denies having had any sort of romantic relationship with Layne. I'll be sharing that quote from her in a few minutes. But first, I want to share more from Maureen Herman regarding this alleged relationship between Kat and Layne. The following quotes are all from Alice in Chains, The Untold Story. The first is from Maureen. Quote, Kat and he seemed to really hit it off and get along, and that ended up turning into a relationship during the tour. And I do remember Layne's bodyguard Val throwing Kat into a tub of water once, because at one point they did kind of connect the dots of Layne getting into trouble by hanging out with us and or Kat specifically. I find it extremely hard to believe that there was not a relationship going on there. It's just not possible. End quote. Lori Barbero, Kat Begelin's other bandmate in Babes in Toyland, recalls things slightly differently. Quote, they didn't disappear that much that I ever thought anything was really going on. I think they were more drug buddies. I think seriously it was the very first night. Layne came to our backstage room and he was like, hey, and just became our friend immediately. And that was kind of his treehouse, as I like to say, where he hung out pretty much all the time. Every day he'd come by and hang out with us. He hung out in our room all the time. I don't really know why. Maybe he just liked to be around ladies, or just to get away from his own crew that he had to be around all the time. But he just really liked hanging out with us, and we just had a lot of fun. Layne really adored Kat. I mean, he wasn't a smack talker. Some guys in bands are just like, ugh, and they pretend their girlfriend's a drag. So if anything happened with another girl, it would be cool, because he didn't really like his girlfriend anyways. From what I gather, however, he really adored her at this point. End quote. Maureen adds the following, quote, it was clear, however, that there was rejection going on, and Kat doesn't take rejection well. Some of her best songs cover that territory. End quote. Kat Begelin at one point overdosed during the tour. Randy Biro, a member of Alice in Chains' crew, once reflected on this. Quote, that whole overdose thing, I think she tried to guilt Layne, and he just said, well, it's not my responsibility to look after her. He felt bad about it, but you can't. It wasn't his fault. He never felt like he was at fault for any of it. End quote. Now, as mentioned, Kat Balin denied having been involved romantically with Layne Staley, and she also denied the excessive heroin usage. This is from Everybody Loves Our Town. Quote, Layne and I hung out around the whole time. We weren't going out, though, just to make that clear. He was like a kindred spirit. We probably had crushes on each other because I punched him in the stomach once, which is like a third grader's crush reaction, right? And then he had his minions throw me in a bucket of water before we were supposed to play. I was immature. I kinda liked him, but you just get confused when you're out around the same people all the time. Let me make this very clear. I never really did heroin on that tour. When I came home and I was bored and depressed with money, yeah, that's when I would do it. In my whole career on tour, though, I'm thinking I did it 3 times. Otherwise, I'd do that thing people do. They kick by drinking themselves to death for at least 4 days, go through the withdrawal symptoms, and be on their way. End quote. Now, unfortunately, as of this posting, from the information that's available online, Kat Balin currently is not in good health. She's struggling with various health issues. Wishing her a speedy recovery to good health. Now, going back to Layne Staley, his infamous self-imposed lockdown in his apartment during the latter stages of his life when DEMRI had passed away is well documented. But even before DEMRI died in '96, Layne was experiencing several dark episodes in that apartment. I'm going to share with you a couple of quotes now, first from Mark Lanigan and then from Johnny Bacolis, an old friend of Layne's who lived with him in the apartment. These quotes describe what Layne was like around the time of Mad Season. Mad Season was the supergroup Layne was a part of from '94 to '96, so these quotes take place in that time period. The first quote is from Mark Lanigan's book Sing Backwards and Weep, where he discusses a very sad episode of Layne where he was experiencing hallucinations in his apartment. Quote, "When I was not developing songs with my band Screaming Trees, I continued making and selling crack. Whenever I was not working, I was spending most of my free time smoking crack and shooting heroin around the clock, with Layne Staley in his apartment. He had a roommate for a while, a really nice normal dude named Johnny, who I had at first suspected to be hired by someone to keep an eye on Layne. It became obvious after a while that Johnny was just a guy who cared for Layne, a friend and a non-drug user. Whenever we got loaded while he was at home, it was in the privacy of Layne's bedroom. Johnny seemed increasingly beat down by the futility and the darkness that began to pervade the place, less happy to see me and less lighthearted every time I'd stop by. Johnny moved out after 6 or 7 months. Unsupervised, the pair of us sank deeper into the crap. Layne called one night and frantically asked me to come over right away. When I got there, I did our secret personal sequence of knocks on the door and heard him shout from down the hall, 'Come in!' That in itself shocked me because he would never leave the door unlocked. I came in, locked the door, and cautiously called his name. 'Down here, man, in the bathroom.' 'Why was the door unlocked, bro?' I asked while approaching the toilet. 'So I can get out of here in a hurry if I have to,' Layne hissed. I entered the bathroom to the strange sight of him lying on his stomach on the floor, his head behind the bathroom toilet, staring intently at a tiny hole in the wall. 'What's going on, brother? Why would you have to get out of here?' I quietly asked, not sure if I really wanted to know the answer. 'Quiet, man. They're back here. Wait a minute and be quiet. They'll come out again,' he forcefully whispered. 'Who are they?' I whispered back. 'The spiders, man. I was asleep when I woke up and they were coming out of my arm.' I had known some truly mentally ill people in my life. I'd spent Christmas Eve in a psych ward with my childhood friend who had been in and out of the mental hospital for years with paranoid schizophrenia. And so with Layne and the spiders, I didn't like the look of this or sound of it at all. 'Hey, Layne, why don't you get up off the floor and let's go sit on the couch for a minute and talk?' 'Shh, quiet, man. They can hear you.' My goodness, I thought. He's lost it. I stood there racking my brain as to what my next steps should be. Whatever they were, they would have to be done with utmost care. I thought about calling Jerry Cantrell, but quickly changed my mind. The Alice guys, Jerry, Sean Kinney, and the bass player Mike Inez, along with producer Toby Wright, had recently enlisted me to try to get Layne out of his apartment and down to a recording studio. They wanted to start making music. Layne would begin by saying, "Tell them I'll be there by 9, and I would relay the message. 9 would turn into 11:30, then 2 a.m., and finally I asked again if he would simply reject the idea out of hand, completely and with a total finality. This routine had gone on for a few days. They would probably be as helpless or more than me in this situation. At least I had a tiny bit of sway with Layne. 'Layne, man, listen to me. I don't see any spiders back there. Just get up for a minute and let's go talk quietly in the living room.' After several long moments of silence, he suddenly slid backwards on his stomach from behind the toilet bowl, got to his feet, and grabbed me by the arm, leading me into the other room. Lifting his sleeve, he showed me an ugly mark on his arm. I caught them crawling out of there and saw one peeking out the hole behind the toilet. 'I have to kill them before they take the whole place over,' he said in a choked and extremely quiet voice. He went to put a rock in his crack pipe, a glass tube with cigarette lighter blackened steel wool, stuffed into the end. "Hold on a sec, bro," I said. "Let's not hit the pipe right now. We need to talk about this rationally." It was pure crack craziness that I was witnessing, a frightening level of psychosis. He was convinced there were spiders coming out of his arms, hiding behind his toilet, and taking over his house. I coaxed him to do a shot of dope instead, in hopes it would even out his mind. Then I talked to him into coming over to my place with me, promising I would hire exterminators to go in and clean his place out if he wished. I was pained beyond words to see him in this way, the sweetest, funniest, most magical and intelligent dude I knew out of his tree. Such was my love for the guy. He had become like the half of me I always lacked. After a couple of days, he was back to normal, but occasionally he'd say something that made it clear these imaginary spiders were still somewhere in the back of his mind. I kept him at my house for a week until one day he looked at me and said, "I lost my mind, didn't I?" I looked at him and the familiar mischievous twinkle normally in his eyes was back. I started laughing. "Thank goodness you realized that. I was afraid we were going to have to hit the nut house." "I'm sorry, man," he smiled. "Man, that was weird." "Yeah, it was, but you ain't got nothing to be worried about, brother. I'm just glad you're back," I said to him with great relief. End quote.
Johnny Bacolis was one of Layne Staley's closest friends. The two of them became friends in high school and played music together. They were both part of the same glam metal band, Alice in Chains, the band before the grunge band. At one point in the mid-90s, Layne Staley and Johnny Bacolis lived together. At the time, Layne Staley was really struggling with depression, and according to Johnny, his depression largely came as a result of his heroin use and the lifestyle it created for him. In an interview with journalist Greg Prado, Johnny Bacolis went into detail about what it was like living with Layne as he was struggling with heroin and depression. Johnny also at one point touches on Mad Season and how Mike McCready really tried to help Layne overcome his struggles. Quote, "Right after they recorded Jar of Flies, Layne was really hitting a wall. We went camping one weekend in that period. He was trying to kick heroin. He asked me if I would move in with him and I guess help him out, which ultimately I just ended up enabling him. Made it a lot easier for him to do what he did. So we lived together in the mid-90s. I was smoking weed. I wasn't doing anything like he was doing. That's why he trusted me, I think. There was such a cloud of depression over that house because of the heroin. If you were to live with any heroin addict, you're going to eventually reach an enough is enough type thing. What he would do is write me letters and put them on the base of my bed. I would wake up in the morning and I would have a 4 to 6 page letter handwritten. And he would explain everything that we talked about the prior night regarding his life, how unhappy he was, and what was going on with him. He didn't really speak about Alice in Chains. As a matter of fact, I wasn't even really allowed to speak about Alice in Chains when I lived with him. There were 2 rules, no interventions and no listening to Alice in Chains music. Unfortunately, he wasn't getting any better. I felt like by me keeping the house clean, doing the laundry, and getting the groceries, I was making it real easy for him to be an addict. After talking to his mom and his stepfather, even his sisters at the time, I came to the realization that I was enabling him more than I was helping him. And now it was taking a personal toll on me, because coming home every night, it was not a happy household. He tried and he wanted it to be. He gave it his all. But with heroin in the calculus, it just wasn't going to be a happy household. I had to make a decision for myself and get out of that environment. The depression came from the cycle of heroin, the lifestyle you lead, the diet. All he really ate day and night was sugar. So I don't think he was getting a lot of nutrients. He wasn't exercising at all. What I've learned from my experience is that it's the lifestyle that kills you more than the heroin. The lifestyle is what causes the ultimate depression and being chained to this horrible drug. Eventually, they turn on you, and now you're depressed. And you may not know a way to get out of it. I had probably just 2 phone calls to Layne during the last couple of years of his life. They were pretty short. There's a time to talk to Layne, and there's a time not to talk to Layne during that point. If someone's using, that's not the time to dive into stuff with them. You wanted to catch him at the perfect opportunity. Now, going back to when Layne and I were living together, the Mad Season thing came about when Mike McCready went to Hazelden Treatment Center to get clean and sober. His roommate was a guy named John Baker Saunders. He told Baker, "Come back to Seattle with me. I'll make sure you have a place to stay. We'll start this band, stay busy, and support each other." So they came back to Seattle, and McCready started calling our house. Mike McCready is one guy that comes to mind that really tried to help Layne. There was this guy, for instance, named Lowell, who loved Layne. Layne himself really listened to and looked up to this guy. McCready would bring Lowell in and give Layne kind of the surprise attack. Personally, I would always tell Layne, why don't you take off? Go to some deserted island, hire the best counselors, and just kick this stuff. Go for 6 months if you have to. Layne's rebuttal would be, Johnny, I have celebrity status, and I have a lot of money. I could fly planes out to deliver me the dope if I wanted to, and that's what I would do. I can't escape.
End quote. The following is a quote from Layne Staley's mother, where she discusses Layne Staley's addiction. This is from Greg Prado's book, Grunge is Dead. Quote,
If you've ever loved an addict that relapses, you trust your love for them, but you never trust the power of that drug on their brain chemistry. You never trust the treatment center if they don't address relapse. I once asked a treatment center counselor on Family Day, what about relapse? What have patients been taught about it? And as a family, what should we do? The counselor looked at me and said, oh, our students never relapse. I knew that we had wasted our time and money. My heart just sank. I felt so horrible for Layne because here I was, his logical, practical, upfront mom who had asked the question that nobody wanted to ask. I felt as though with all the parents, loved ones, and families surrounding these young people, they would give us a number or a counselor we could call in case we were worried. I was so blind and naive. In a way, it was like the drug had a spokesperson right there in that room, and it was the counselor. It was sickening. When Layne went to Hazelden Treatment Center, had he stayed longer and been able to build long-term friendships and sponsors, I believe Layne would have had a chance. Kurt Cobain said it would take 3 years for him to have a solid new start, and I believe he was correct. But Layne became addicted to drugs when he was quite young, and he never really learned mature problem solving. He just didn't have the wisdom you get over a period of years. Some of the people around Layne were wonderful, sweet-hearted, and professional, and truly had his interests at heart. A young person who is drug addicted can't help bumping up against sleazy people in the entertainment industry. Not necessarily the professionals, but others down the line. You can't stay clean and sober without clean and sober people around you, without a bodyguard mentality. Layne would have had to have been superhuman. Nobody expected him to be that. It takes walking away for a long period of time with the support of the music industry, i.e., had he stayed at Hazelden. Layne told me, Mom, I have a contract to fulfill. There are over 40 people on the payroll, and they all count on me being out there. That's where he was coming from, that he had a responsibility to the contract and his people. We need a humane society for musicians. The murderous conditions of the partnership between the drug community and the entertainment industry, anyone that supports it at any level is part of every drug death. It starts with the guy at the top who's making how many millions of dollars importing it and getting it into the country. I'd like that guy to sit across knee to knee with Layne and explain to him his rationale. I would say that Layne's form of addiction was aggressive. If it was a cancer, you sure wouldn't say, well, you've got 2 more albums to complete. All these people are on your payroll. I use this analogy. Some people try recreational drugs and it acts as a single unbarred hook. It's in, it slips out, and they walk away. Some people try recreational drugs and they get hooked. It's a single hook with a barb. They're still able to slip free. Some people get hooked with a double barbed hook, and over time, it does tremendous damage. Some people get hooked with a triple barbed hook, and there is not flipping that thing free. And the longer it's in there, without some outside help to extricate it, the more inevitable and severe the damage is. That fish is going to die. Every disease is like that. Some people get cancer. They discover it early, the treatment works, and it's rather non-invasive. Depending on the degree of the cancer and the kind of cancer, sometimes it's treatable, sometimes it's not. Sometimes it goes into remission. Sometimes it spreads to other parts of the body. Drug addiction comes in all different degrees, and in Layne's case, it was a death grip. He needed to be cut loose from his financial responsibilities in order to get the help he required, and it needed to be mandated. Because of the way the laws are written, you can intervene with a meeting, but you can't make an addict get help. That law was written so that someone's estate can't be appropriated unless you can prove that they can't tend their business. It's almost impossible to probe because there are all degrees of sanity, and some of it borders on insanity. What kept us from helping Layne was the same law that protected his estate. Sadly, one is a human life being treated the same as accumulated goods. These cases need to be handled on an individual basis. We were not able to help our son. When you're using drugs, you're not an adult making adult decisions. The drug is thinking for you. Its fangs are a death grip. I didn't believe that I would be doing much good poking away at him. Layne, you've got to do this and you've got to do that. I was trying to stay really close in my thoughts and conversations with him. I didn't want Layne to ever feel ashamed. All of us know that there are miracles around recovery. In Alaska, I was attending 12-step meetings at an A1 Anon for the family, friends, employers, employees, and concerned others of alcoholics and addicts. I was learning a lot. I probably read 200 books on the effects and studies of alcohol, addiction, and families. I was trying to discover the key. I wanted to be a voice for the one little phrase that might be the aha for Layne. If it wasn't me, I wanted somebody to find those magic words that would bring Layne back to himself. I never lost hope that I or someone would be able to do that. I educated myself about the disease so I could talk with Layne and understand. But a non-addict can never understand. They can only accept and believe that the addict is telling the truth. An addict and a non-addict don't think the same. Their brains are wired completely differently. Only an addict can help another addict through recovery. Layne's ex-girlfriend DEMRI, her mother and I take solace in knowing that our children experience great love from one another and that they are no longer suffering. In order for Layne to have lived, he should have been released from his contract with great love, acceptance, and respect. And yes, there was a contract, and yes, there was a commitment. But I don't think that a person has to... He didn't sign up to go to Iraq, for goodness sake. He signed up for fun and hard work, and he gave his heart and soul and life. At some point, it was real obvious that he couldn't go on, and that he needed freedom from the commitments. Maybe, after several years of true recovery, not just cleaning up, going back out, cleaning up, going back out, maybe the band could have done what the band is doing now, with Layne still at the helm. If you're in a situation where everything you do is under the microscope, everything about your life is being planned and managed by somebody else, and that life includes dealers putting free drugs in your pocket to keep you coming back, it's hell on earth. Then people watch and wait for you to die because they're going to sell all that stuff they stole out of your storage unit. They're going to see to it that it gets to an auction house specializing in sports and rock memorabilia, where it gets sold. Then your parents are going to have to buy it back with your hard-earned money. It's very disgusting, that tangled web that they weave. Maybe a person that's involved in that whole web of destruction thinks it's a funny, challenging game. I'd like for that person to have to sit down and talk to my son. I think Layne knew he was dying, but he didn't plan on it. He had just gotten his driver's license renewed and he was in the middle of arts projects. I really expected that Layne would survive this ordeal. Nobody should die like that. I wish the dealers could have seen what I saw, and truly, may they be punished. Lots of fans and family members try to reassure me. People try to find the right words to say, the right thing to console and make us feel better. It's kind, and it's the right thing to do. They say things like, now he's in heaven singing in God's choir. You still have his music to listen to, or he'll live on through his music and we'll always hear his voice. I would want young people to understand that you don't have to accomplish anything huge to be loved. If Layne had chosen any other career, I couldn't have loved him more. People say, well, you have your daughters to console you. I say, you don't understand. My daughters lost their brother. It's just as profound for them, but a different loss, and I have to be there for them. When you strip away all of that, what you have left is loving someone, and Layne knew that. He once wrote on an anniversary card to us, all we need is love. This should never have happened. Layne was sacrificed. No one should be sacrificed. We should all live long, happy lives. A goal for all of us is to try and make the world a better place. When all is said and done, and all the platitudes are stripped away, and all the condolences and the gifts and the cards and everyone shares their thoughts, my child has died. I think the most important thing to remember is that no human being should be seen or treated as a commodity. People should remember him in their own way. He's a human being first. He may have represented other things, but he is a real person who needed to live and wanted to live and should never, never have suffered this horrible death. How should Layne be remembered? He didn't want to be remembered as a drug addict. He wanted to be remembered for what he created and gave to the world. Sadly, the addiction took him too soon, or he would have been able to share more of himself with us. But for me, I feel as though I'm attached to Layne, and that he's with me at every minute. How I would want others to remember him, I can't say. But I do know how I remember him, and that is every moment.
End quote. Unfortunately, as we've been discussing, drugs were very prevalent in the 90s Seattle music scene. Many people, not just Layne, struggled with addiction. I'm going to share with you now another quote from Mark Lanigan's book, Sing Backwards and Weep, involving DEMRI PARROTT and also Mike Starr. Mike Starr was the bassist in Alice in Chains until 1993. This story takes place at Mark Lanigan's Seattle apartment in 1995. Quote,
I got buzzed by someone at the front door. To my unhappy surprise, there was DEMRI, dressed in a white hospital gown, wheeling a pole with an IV bottle at my front door in broad daylight. I was pissed beyond words. What the heck, DEMRI? What happened to you? She lowered her gown and showed me the ugly red vertical scar running down the middle of her chest. I got an illness, and they gave me a pacemaker. She smiled, as if she were telling me she won the lottery. Mark, do you have any dope? I'll even take cottons, whatever. Are you kidding me? No way, get yourself back to the hospital, you're out of your mind, I told her. The illness she had was endocarditis, a dreaded illness an IV drug user could catch from the bacteria in heroin. It destroyed your heart valves and was often deadly. That she contracted the infection, had to have a pacemaker installed, and still wheeled herself over here to try to get high, blew my mind. The unforgiving power of her addiction was shocking. I callously shut the door on her mid-sentence during her plea for drugs, turned around, walked back upstairs to my apartment, and turned off the buzzer. Like my first meeting with DEMRI at the dope house, I kept this episode to myself, not wanting to cause Layne any more heartbreak than he'd already taken. Around the same time, Mike Starr also buzzed me one night. Surprised to see him, I opened the door and let him in. He was the ex-bass player for Alice in Chains. I hadn't seen him in years. What the heck, Mike? How you been? Mike replied, Man, I just got busted but made bail. I'm dope sick as hell. Are you holding anything? I had not known Mike as a junkie during the time we spent together touring. As far as I was concerned, he was just a strange cat like the trailer park hoodlums I'd grown up with. Not super intelligent, but with a dubious gift for getting over on people. Sorry to hear that, bro. Come up to my place, I told him. Once inside my apartment, I saw that despite the cold weather, he was dressed in only a white t-shirt and a pair of white boxer shorts. No shoes, nothing. Sorry, Mike, I don't have any dope. Just a little crack for sale if you're interested. I lied about the dope, since I could plainly see he wasn't holding a wallet or any dough. Crack was something I could share a tiny bit of if he were so inclined. Aw, crap, what am I gonna do? He was talking to himself, not me. Mark, can I use your phone? Sure, Mike, go ahead. He got on the phone and went around the corner into my kitchen for some privacy, but in his agitated state, he did not notice me standing right outside the door listening. No, he doesn't have any, he muttered emphatically to whoever was on the other line. He's got crack, that's all I know. No, I don't know if he's got cash up here. Someone had either coerced Mike into trying to burn me, or he was just a scout for whoever came next. He hung up the phone. Hey Mike, sorry I couldn't help you out, but I gotta go somewhere, so you gotta split. Then he asked me, hey, can I catch a ride with you? Sorry man, I'm not riding. I'll see you later, Mike. I opened my infrequently used kitchen door and gently shoved him out, locking the door behind him. For the next 10 minutes or so, he continued knocking intermittently, saying quietly, hey Mark, hey bro, can I come back in? I didn't answer him. Instead, I sat on my couch with a gun. The loaded stolen Desert Eagle 44 Magnum pistol I had traded $50 worth of crack for. Just in case there was going to be more to this scene with Mike than met the eye. Eventually, I heard him sigh heavily and the hallway floor creaking as he walked barefoot softly away down the corridor and to the stairs. I would not see him again for several more years.
End quote.
On February 8th, 1996, an article was published in Rolling Stone entitled Alice in Chains to Hell and Back. John Widerhorn wrote the following, quote, Despite the evidence, Staley won't acknowledge that he still battles with heroin. If I'm staying busy, and if I'm getting my job done, and I'm doing things I think are great, then I don't have a problem with anything, you know, says Layne Staley. If I live on just a strictly sugar diet, hey, I like it. He laughs weakly and nervously, then continues. Nobody ever asks Meatloaf, what do you eat? Why do you eat so much? Shouldn't you lose some weight? No, he shouldn't. He's Meatloaf. He writes songs and he has a great time, and none of your business. Maybe he eats meatloaf every night, you know. People have a right to ask questions and dig deep when you're hurting people and things around you, Staley continues. But when I haven't talked to anybody in years, and every article I see is dope this, junkie that, whiskey this, That ain't my title. Like, hi, I'm Layne, nail-biter, you know? My bad habits aren't my title. My strengths and my talent are my title. Layne Staley's argument might carry more weight if he didn't write about using drugs. 5 songs on Dirt were about heroin, and several tracks on the Dog record are drug-related. From the song Sludge Factory, for instance, there's the lyric, "Things go well, your eyes dilate, you shake and I'm high." Or from the song Head Creeps, there's the line, "No more time, just one more time." Yet, Layne says he's reluctant to talk about his addiction, not because he's embarrassed, but because he's worried his fans will think he's glorifying drugs. "I wrote about drugs, and I didn't think I was being unsafe or careless by writing about them," Layne says. "Here's how my thinking pattern went. When I tried drugs, they were great, and they worked for me for years, and now they're turning against me, and now I'm walking through hell, and this sucks. I didn't want my fans to think that heroin was cool, but then I've had fans come up to me and give me the thumbs up, telling me they're high. That's exactly what I didn't want to happen." Although Layne Staley won't go into any details about his past or present drug use, he admits to having an addictive personality. "When I'm not doing drugs, I eat," he says, "and I binge and I gain 20 pounds, and I work out, and when I start working out, I go crazy on it. I can't do anything in small doses. If I sat there and said, I'm 90 days sober and easy does it, stay the course, I'd be full of it, because I'm not 90 days sober. But I'm not in the bathroom getting high either. But 2 years ago, I would have been. It's not something I think about. It's not something I wake up and have to go find," says Layne Staley.
End quote.
An old friend of Layne's, Ron Holt, also had heroin issues. In an interview with journalist David DeSola, Ron Holt, reflecting on his own heroin struggles, speculated on what he thought may have been going through Layne Staley's head. He also reflects on how, in his opinion, Layne Staley may have actually wanted to create more music, but Layne's addiction was just taking over his life. This is from Alice in Chains' The Untold Story. Quote, "There's something that happens when you're an addict, where it becomes bad and you want to stop. I think that's what Layne became. I think that he could have, and probably somewhere desired to, create more than he did." End quote. Now, to Ron Holt's point about addicts wanting to fight their addiction, but then sometimes, quote-unquote, accepting their fate, it should be noted that, according to Alice in Chains drummer Sean Kinney, Layne Staley once told him that he was going to die from drugs, that there was no escaping it. It's a very sad thing to hear, and I hope that anyone listening to this who may have their own struggles, that you're able to find the courage and the strength to be able to overcome what's in front of you. The following is from Sean Kinney regarding Layne Staley's death. This is from Grunge is Dead. Quote, "It wasn't a mystery. Layne told me straight up, I'm never coming back. I'm not going to quit doing drugs. I'm going to die like this. This is it. So I'm like the codependent girlfriend. No, but I knew that was a fact. It was just horrible. I've lost a lot of friends and put myself in a lot of screwed up situations. The way he looked at me and how he said it, I just knew that he had made his decision. And you can't change people's minds. People buy a record and read a magazine and they think they know you. They come up and give you didn't try to help him, you could have saved him. It's like, we did everything. We were as supportive as anyone could be. If somebody doesn't want it, they don't want it. It's not like he was a bitter guy and there was hatred. He just made his decision. A lot of damage had been done. He seemed like he was good with it. I'm not good with it. I'm not good with it today. I never was then. Probably never will be. I quit answering the phone for 5 or 6 years. I didn't want that phone call. Ironically, it all went down on April 5th, the same day Kurt died 8 years earlier. Just bizarre timing on that. By then, I had started going away from lots of drugs and just started drinking. Like that's any better." End quote. The following is a quote from Mike Inez, Alice in Chains bass player, where he reflects on Layne Staley's death. This quote is from the book Grunge is Dead. Quote, "There was one poignant moment for me. We were doing rehearsals at the Moore Theater in Seattle, and we were getting ready to go out with Metallica on a couple of dates, a stadium tour. It became real apparent that we couldn't do this. It felt like the wrong thing to do, so we pulled the plug on it. I don't want to say what went on in the meeting, but when I was walking away from the Moore Theater down the alley, it was raining. I turned around and saw Layne walking down by himself down the alley. When I look back on it now, it's the moment that, for me, everything turned around. I went, we're not healthy. That was a real dark time. I took a look at the album cover for the Dog record. It was very gray, and I think that's where we were at. Layne was going through the depths of his heroin addiction. It was really tough watching that, and it permeated into everything we did. Not to throw rocks at glass houses, we were all pretty messed up at that point. But not in that way, though. We weren't that miserable, it seemed. I just really feel bad for the guy. I wish I could change the world for everybody who's in that place. That was definitely one of the hardest records I've ever had to work on. But some great stuff came out of it. Heaven Beside You, and we got a Grammy nomination. We were still touching people. He was in a really dark place, though. It's hard to see it, kind of inaccessible to all of us. I'd stop by, me and Mark Lanigan would go by and beat on his door. It's hard to get people if they don't want to be gotten. I can't really walk in Layne's shoes because I have not tried that drug. I was always Mr. Pothead, smoking the green bud and drinking Coronas. I never got into the depths of drug addiction that heavy. I was sitting in my kitchen, the phone rings, and it was Sean Kinney. He says, "Hey, sit down. Layne's gone." I just couldn't believe it. Ann Wilson put it great. She spoke at his funeral, and Ann and Nancy sang a song called Sand. One of Ann's best friends and employees died from AIDS, and she wrote the song about him. It's just this beautiful acoustic piece. She said Layne was too fragile for this earth. God bless Layne. He was my favorite vocalist. I've never heard of a vocalist that had that much soul. He was hurt, and that pain certainly came through. A lot of people identified with it.
End quote.
Duff McKagan is from Seattle, and although he's best known as the original bassist in Guns N' Roses, he was actually very well connected in the Seattle underground punk and grunge scene well before it became famous. Duff saw firsthand how heroin impacted many of the people in that world, including Layne Staley. According to Duff McKagan, he and Mark Lanigan once tried to visit Layne during these last years at his apartment to talk to him. Quote, "The apartment he had was not far from my house in Seattle. He lived probably 12 blocks away. Back in 2001 or so, Mark Lanigan and I were going to go up to his apartment and try to talk to him. I think Mark tried and wanted me to go up. I didn't though. It wouldn't have done any good." End quote. Now, as mentioned, Duff McKagan is from Seattle and witnessed much of the heroin problems facing the music scene and the city in general firsthand. The following is a quote from Duff McKagan where he discusses the subject. This is from Grunge is Dead. Quote, "Sometime in 1982, as the music scene became bigger and a recession hit Seattle, we all noticed a huge influx of heroin and pills. Addiction suddenly skyrocketed within my circle of friends, and death by overdose became almost commonplace. I witnessed my first overdose when I was 18. I saw the love of my life wither away because of smack, and one of my best friends imploded because of it. By the time I was 23, 2 of my best friends had died from heroin. In Seattle, heroin was fast becoming a staple in pretty much everyone's diet, not just musicians. Up until 1982, I had heard about heroin, but rarely saw it. Then suddenly, I began to see a lot of older kids starting to use heroin openly. As more and more of my contemporaries lost their jobs, smack spread quickly. It would be everywhere by 1983. I didn't plan on leaving Seattle. What happened in Seattle in the early 80s, recession hit Seattle especially hard. There was no Microsoft, there was just Boeing. Boeing was going through some problems in the 70s. They were threatening closing down, and there were billboards around Seattle. Would the last person who leaves Seattle please turn the light out? Basically, Seattle was going to shut down. And it almost did in the early 80s. You'd go downtown and I swear it would be like newspapers blowing down the street. Pretty desolate. And heroin started to creep its way into the scene. It became epidemic by 83. There was pretty much no place to play except for rented rehearsal places. If you were 21 and over, I guess there was, but it wasn't supported by the punk rock scene because everybody was underage. That's when I bailed, in August of 84. In general, in the late 80s and early 90s, there was a lot of heroin around. There were a lot of drugs and alcohol infiltrated into bands.
End quote.
The following is a quote from Mark Arm of Mudhoney, where he discusses Layne Staley's drug addiction. This quote is from Grunge is Dead. Quote, "Pearl Jam did this satellite radio thing. They did that twice, and we played both of them. Mad Season played on as well, and I remember Layne coming in. He had his hair up in this knob off the top of his head. He was so thin and greenish gray. I had a hard time looking at him. I didn't even have the guts to talk to him. The whole thing made me squeamish and reminded me of my own bad times. Even if I did talk to him, I don't know what I would have said. Seeing him so far down the line on this trajectory that he had set for himself made me queasy. It seems to me like once he discovered heroin, he decided he was going to fully embrace it. Based on the songs on Dirt, he just jumped in. That was the myth he made for himself, and he was living it out. The reference to him in Mudhoney's song Into Your Shtick is about that. Once he created his persona of a wasted rock star, he had to follow it to its ugly conclusion.
End quote.
Layne Staley's last show with the band would take place in '96 as a result of his increasing addiction to drugs. The show took place on July 3rd of '96 in Kansas City when the band opened that day for Kiss. Reflecting on Layne Staley's final show, the staff at PARROTT magazine once wrote the following, quote, "His addiction had made regular band activities an impossibility. But one opportunity they were afforded was to cut an MTV Unplugged album in the spring of '96, and the group did not disappoint. They also grabbed the opportunity to open for one of America's most beloved and highest-earning rock acts of all time, Kiss, and their hyped-up reunion tour. Now, Scott Weiland and his own drug use had forced the original opening band Stone Temple Pilots out of the picture. Alice in Chains picked up the baton. Taking to the stage ahead of Kiss's reunion was a daunting prospect, and we imagine being faced with 40,000 die-hard Kiss fans, likely all in makeup, is about as tough as it gets. But Staley and the band were more than a match for them. The band opened their part of the tour on June 28th of '96 in Detroit. They concluded their tour at the Kemper Arena in Kansas City on July 3rd. A short while after the show, Layne Staley suffered a severe overdose and was hospitalized." End quote. Reflecting on both the Kiss tour and Unplugged, drummer Sean Kinney once said the following. This is from Grunge is Dead. Quote, "Me and Jerry especially wanted to do the Kiss tour. I was in the Kiss Army, and they were bringing back the original lineup. Layne kept saying, I don't want to do it, so we gave up on it. We didn't hear about it for a while. They must have asked again, and he said, I'll do it. Those ended up being the last shows we played in public. They went great. They were fun. It was nice being out there. It was only 5 or 6 shows, and by the end of the shows, the last one, it was cops, ambulance, and get on the plane, hide the drugs. The same stuff was going on. It became more apparent that unless things seriously change, we can't go out and play to our potential at this level. We can't even get through a week and a half without drama and scary stuff going on. That's about right when I started mentally preparing like, it's done. Same thing with MTV Unplugged. They kept asking if we'd do it. Up to the moment, it was just a nail-biter. Barely any rehearsing at all. Guys not showing up, the same stuff. Rolled out there and everything thankfully worked. Right then is when I knew, okay, if we never do anything again, I'm good with this. I'd rather leave on a high point instead of throwing drug paraphernalia into a garbage can in an airport, hoping to not get arrested while I jump on a plane. That's when I started to distance myself from it and just preparing for the worst, which it eventually happened.
End quote.
The following is from ex-Alice in Chains manager Susan Silver on Layne Staley's drug addiction. This is from Grunge is Dead. Quote, "The Dirt record, the making of that record, started to be compromised. It took longer periods of time to get things done. It started to be undeniable. After Andy Wood died, there's this denial factor. And I was already deep in a struggle with my own brother, who was also a heroin addict. For me, this couldn't happen to someone else who hasn't gone down that road already, because they'll see this is where it leads. So I had a certain amount of denial that it was a problem with Layne in the beginning. And then it just became my life as the Dirt cycle unfolded. I spent more hours every single day focused on and dealing with heroin addiction than I did managing my client's career. It became a behemoth. I lost my brother to the battle, so it was all-consuming. It was a horror show so much of the time, which ultimately led to nothing except pure trauma on my part to see my own husband go down that road so many years later. It was shocking. By the beginning of the tour cycle with Dirt, it was something that I was dealing with every day. And through that cycle, there were many cancellations and incidences. But Layne never gave up hope. He was not a sneaky drug addict. He was open about his struggle. He tried so hard on numerous occasions to get clean, through rehabs, and was willing to talk with people about it. He was willing to talk to the press about it. He was really honest about it, often apologetic about it. It kept taking him down. The thing about Soundgarden and Alice, they had really clear musical direction within the group. What an outside producer or A&R person had to say about the music was irrelevant. It really just bounced off. In a sense, there wasn't any pressure from the outside like that. Internally, everyone had a pretty strong agreement as to what they liked. They were making some amazing music. Of course, however, by that time, a big part of Alice in Chains' focus and struggle was drug addiction. The dog record in particular in 1995 really was painful putting together. It took 8 or 9 months, hours and hours of waiting for Layne to come out of the bathroom. Days of waiting for him to show up at the studio. And through all those last years, he and I were really close. I kept telling him, you don't have to do this. You have enough money to go and have a quiet life if that's what you want, with his longtime girlfriend DEMRI. Just go and do what makes you happy. Don't do this if this is what's perpetuating your addiction. I didn't understand that it wasn't the music that was making him take his drugs. He had a disease, and it was getting worse. But I was always saying, what do you want to do? We can stop. He'd say, I want to keep going. In terms of music, I'm not talking about drugs. He wanted to keep creating and recording. It was a really painful session because it took so long. It was so horrifying to see him in that condition. Yet, when he was cognizant, he was the sweetest, bright-eyed guy you'd ever want to meet. To be in a meeting with him and have him fall asleep in front of you was gut-wrenching. As the timeline will show, we stopped. We stopped many times to say, this isn't going to work. We can't keep doing this. Even if he says he wants to. It's just tearing everybody to shreds.
He wouldn't answer the phone, wouldn't answer the door. Every once in a while, he'd let one guy in that had been friends with the Alice guys who ultimately worked in my office. I was one of the only people he would let in to see him and bring him things from the office. He was very much housebound. He came out for a recording session, and that was the last time I saw him. The session was supposed to be at 4 in the afternoon. He finally got there at midnight. And that's just the way it was with Layne. You go to pick him up, to take him somewhere, and the next thing you know, 4 hours have gone by. He could pull you into the world, shuffling around, getting somewhere over here, and then getting somewhere over there. Doing something on the Game Boy, and then doing something on the TV. Days would go by. He came to that session. I hadn't seen him maybe since I went to his apartment in 1996 to tell him that his girlfriend died. I hardly recognized him. He looked different. He didn't look like himself anymore. But he had the same sparkling wit. Looking at him thinking, my goodness, he's physically changed, yet just as sweet, just as funny. Quoting lines from silly Nickelodeon at night TV shows. The news of his death was a phone call we all feared for years. No one had heard from him. And the people that we were in touch with to let us know that he was still okay hadn't heard from him. His little odd weekly habits had stopped. Sean got a call from one of those people and said, I'm going over there and I'm going to kick the door. I have this sick feeling in my gut. I said, Sean, we need to get his family involved. His stepdad and his mom. When he didn't answer the door or respond in any way, the police opened the door, and the rest is history. In 2006, Alice in Chains decided to take a brave step and go do what they love to do, play Alice in Chains songs. It took 4 years after Layne's death and 9 years after they had last played together to play again. So they did a benefit for CARE, for the tsunami victims of Southeast Asia that raised over $100,000. I said, why don't you go do something else? So, into the picture come Ann and Nancy Wilson again, who I really want to stress what incredible guidance they've given musicians in this community. In March 2006, PARROTT was doing a VH1 special, Decades Live. Usually they take classic rock musicians and bring new musicians to play one of each other's songs. And Ann and Nancy asked if Alice would like to play. So we all went out there, which for me was significant because it was 5 days after I had signed settlements with Chris. Went off to the East Coast with the gracious hosting of Ann and Nancy once again. I realized that it was okay. As much mental anguish as we had gone through, is it okay to go on without Layne? This mantra kept going through my head as I'm watching these guys rehearse. Choose to live, choose to live. They chose to live in what they love to do, play music. That was really inspiring. It gets to the point where they're going to do an Alice song during Heart's set, which is Rooster. Ann wanted William DuVall to sing. She did, all these years later, what Chris did for Eddie at the Moore Theater, when Mookie Baylock played for Alice in Chains and gave her blessing to William at that moment during the show. I know that it's really personal for me, but it was also a historic moment. That specific acknowledgement towards how things are now, that there's a history not to be forgotten, and there's a history about to be made.
Hi guys, this is where Layne Staley died on April 5th, 2002. Before I continue, I want to mention that this location is public domain information. There are several print sources, online articles, photos, and videos which list the address of this building. But regardless, I won't be listing the address in this video out of respect for the privacy of those living here. And I made sure not to use any shots of the building where anyone living here is visible. Layne Staley used to live here. His condo is this unit at the top corner. I want to read to you a quote from Layne Staley's mother where she describes the moment she first saw Layne Staley's body in the condo. I'll be going into detail about exactly what happened, but first, I want to start off with this quote because I find that this quote really shows the human tragedy in this all. Sometimes when it comes to famous people, it's easy to forget their humanity and to forget that the families of famous people are affected by death. Here's the quote from Layne's mother, Nancy McCallum. The police first went into Layne's condo, and then I said, well, I need to go in and be with him. And they said, oh, I wouldn't do that. And I said, I can do this. I've always promised myself that if anything happened to my children, I would be there for them. And I went in and he was tiny, and I thought at first that he had made like a life-size mannequin of himself because he had lots and lots of art projects always. And I thought, somebody could have thrown that little guy over their shoulder and walked down the street and nobody would have even known that it was a real person. I sat with him for a few minutes, and I told him that I was really sorry how things had turned out, because, of course, we tried to not pressure him. We always felt like pressure would just push him to the wrong place, and he knew what he had to do. He had to go in treatment, stay in treatment, communicate with his sponsor, stay with healthy people, but the music industry doesn't afford you the time to do that. And those aren't healthy people. A lot of them are not. It was pretty tough to get cleaned up. By then, he had pretty much been secluded. So it was shocking to see my child like that. It should have turned out better. And it's been amazing how many people have expressed their love and support. Layne Staley had struggled with drug addiction for many years, and after Layne's body was examined, the official autopsy and toxicology report stated that he died from an accidental speedball overdose. A speedball is a mix of heroin and cocaine. Layne Staley weighed only 86 pounds at the time of his death, and if you factor in that he was around 6 feet tall, it really paints a dark image of how severe the drugs impacted him. In response to his death, the surviving members of Alice in Chains released the following statement. It's good to be with friends and family as we struggle to deal with this immense loss, and try to celebrate his immense life. We are looking for all the usual things: comfort, purpose, answers, something to hold on to, a way to let him go in peace. Mostly, we are feeling heartbroken over the death of our beautiful friend. He was a sweet man with a keen sense of humor and a deep sense of humanity. He was an amazing musician, an inspiration, and a comfort to so many. He made great music and gifted it to the world. We are proud to have known him, to be his friend, and to create music with him. For the past decade, Layne struggled greatly. We can only hope that he has at last found some peace. We love you, Layne, dearly, and we will miss you endlessly. One of the most tragic things about Layne's death is that he was actually dead for 2 weeks before people knew he had died. On April 17, 2002, Layne's mother, Nancy McCallum, had gone to Layne's condo, though she wasn't able to get inside. More on that shortly. She went to Layne's condo in order to let him know about the passing of DEMRI PARROTT's brother, DEMRI PARROTT being Layne Staley's ex-fiancé. On October 29, 1996, DEMRI PARROTT died of a drug overdose herself. Layne had already been struggling from drug addiction for several years at this point, but the death of his fiancée only made things worse for him. In 2002, the year that Layne died, Mark Lanigan from the Screaming Trees told Rolling Stone magazine that Layne Staley, quote, never recovered from DEMRI's death, end quote. Layne Staley purchased this condo in April of 1997, 5 years before his death. During those last 5 years of his life, Layne became more and more reclusive, rarely leaving his condo. Alice in Chains drummer Sean Kinney recalls the following. It got to a point where he kept himself so locked up, both physically and emotionally. I kept trying to make contact. 3 times a week, like clockwork, I'd call him, but he'd never answer. Every time I was in the area, I was up in front of his place yelling for him. Even if you could get inside his building, he wasn't going to open the door. You'd phone and he wouldn't answer. You couldn't just kick the door in and grab him, though there were so many times I thought about doing that. The last time Layne recorded with Alice in Chains was in October of 1998, when the band recorded Get Born Again and Died, both of which were released in 99 as part of the Music Bank box set. Shortly after, in November of 98, Layne Staley recorded vocals for a band called Class of 99, a short-lived supergroup which also featured Stephen Perkins from Jane's Addiction, Martin Lenoble from Porno for Pyros, Tom Morello from Rage Against the Machine, and Matt Serletic, who's worked with Collective Soul, Cher, and others. The band recorded a cover of Pink Floyd's Another Brick in the Wall Part 2, which, as of the time of this recording, is the last known studio recording to feature Layne Staley on vocals. One of Layne Staley's friends has said that Layne was actually going to audition for Audioslave in 2001, but Tom Morello has since stated this is not true. In any case, with the exception of one radio interview Layne Staley took part in on July 19, 1999, with the rest of the guys from Alice in Chains, Layne Staley essentially disappeared from the public eye. Layne Staley's mother, Nancy, has said that she and Layne's family would occasionally see him from time to time. The last time Layne's mother saw him was around Valentine's Day in 2002, about 2 months before his death. Now, going back to April 17, 2002. That day, Nancy McCallum went to Layne Staley's condo in order to tell him about the death of DEMRI PARROTT's brother, but there was no answer. 2 days later, on April 19th, Nancy McCallum got a call from Susan Silver, one of the people who managed Alice in Chains. Susan Silver informed Nancy McCallum that Layne's accountants had said no money had been withdrawn from Layne's bank account in 2 weeks. Nancy went back to the condo that day to check on Layne, but again, as was the case 2 days before, there was no answer. This is when Nancy McCallum called 911. Nancy, the police, and Jim Elmer, Layne's father, were all at the scene for this tragic day. The autopsy confirmed that Layne Staley had died 2 weeks earlier on April 5, 2002. By the time his body was found on April 19th, it had already partially decomposed. The last person to see Layne Staley alive was his friend and former Alice in Chains bandmate Mike Starr. In an interview on VH1's Celebrity Rehab, which took place in 2010, Mike Starr stated that he had spent time with Layne Staley the day before he died, which would have been April 4th. April 4th being Mike Starr's birthday. According to Mike Starr, Layne was very ill and Mike wanted to call 911, but Layne protested. Furthermore, according to Mike Starr, Layne even threatened to end their friendship if he had called 911. The two got into an argument and Mike Starr eventually stormed out of Layne's condo. Layne actually called Mike after he left and said, quote, "Not like this, don't leave like this," end quote. Layne died the following day, and Mike Starr has said that he regrets not calling 911. Layne's mother Nancy was present during the VH1 interview with Mike Starr and told him that it's not his fault that Layne died, and that no one in their family holds him accountable for Layne's death. Tragically, Mike Starr himself died on March 8, 2011 from a prescription drug overdose. The tragedy of Mike Starr's and Layne Staley's deaths are still felt by many today.